Hi everybody, I'm Jack, the Rambling Raconteur, and for maybe Midrash, for a fiction selection, this month I read Barabbas by Pär Lagerkvist, a Swedish novelist, and like linguist I almost want to say. He was a member of the Swedish Academy, the 18 Immortals, similar to the French Academy that sort of like governs language and culture in that nation. So in Sweden they have 18. I think at some point there were supposed to be 20, half of the 40 in France, but they just ended up with 18. Interestingly enough, they're the 18 who, as a group, select the Nobel Prize for Literature. Ironically, a little home court advantage. Pär Lagerkvist won the Nobel Prize in Literature just a couple of years after he published this book, Barabbas. So he was in his late middle age when this book was written. And it's interesting. I think it was published like right around 1950. And it reflects some of those themes that are found in the Swedish films by Ingmar Bergman. Specifically the Seventh Seal. So sort of like the idea of like God's silence, like how do we reconcile death with the Christian worldview? How do we reconcile evil or plague, like in a very timely way, with a world where there is a benevolent creator who's involved in our lives? And so Barabbas does not take quite that tone, but it feels very much like adjacent to it, like they sit next to each other. And it's an interesting book. It's short and it's written in a peculiar style. It's not what you would expect, I should say. It doesn't feel dense in the way that a lot of modernist texts do. It's not long. It's not convoluted in like a recitation of everything going through someone's mind and head. It doesn't involve deeply complex language. It honestly feels like you're reading something written by somebody who spent a lot of time with Ernest Hemingway. The sentences are quick, short, declarative. And part of that, I think, is the idea that Lagerkvist is trying to show Barabbas is an uneducated, thief, bandit, murderer. He doesn't have formal education or schooling. He grew up with a group of bandits where he was, beaten up periodically. He was severely cut, so he has a scar that's described. And so we have this very simple man who we see he's not led a positive life, and he is utterly baffled and confused about why the heck he was ever allowed to be freed, and Jesus Christ, Jesus of Nazareth, crucified. He can't understand that, and he ultimately is haunted by it. He is totally baffled by the fact that he was freed. He's baffled by the fact that this other man who was so obviously like not a bad guy, hadn't murdered anybody, why that man was crucified. And he goes to the crucifixion, and here's what he experiences there. And just as well if the end came soon, Barabbas thought, so that the poor man would not have to suffer any more. If only the end would come. As soon as the end came, he would hurry away and never think of this again. But all at once the hill grew dark, as though the light had gone out of the sun. It was almost pitch dark, and in the darkness above, the crucified man cried out in a loud voice, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" It sounded horrible. Whatever did he mean? And why had it grown dark? It was the middle of the day. It was quite unaccountable. The 3 crosses were just faintly visible up there. It looked weird. Something terrible was surely going to happen. The soldiers had leaped to their feet and grabbed their weapons. Whatever happened, they always rushed for their weapons. They stood there around the crosses with their lances, and he heard them whispering together in alarm. Now they were frightened. Now they were not grinning any longer. They were superstitious, of course. He was afraid himself, and glad when it began to get light and everything became a little more normal. And so he's baffled by this experience. He goes back to Jerusalem, and he meets a woman who had interacted with Jesus and chosen not to be healed. And he had said to her, she has a hair lip, and he had said to her, "You're going to testify for me." And so they kind of interact, and he gradually encounters different people over that sort of from Good Friday all around to Easter Sunday, he encounters people. He encounters a large man who seems also like him, somewhat simple, speaks in a Galilean dialect, and is just so upset. No, I know nothing about it. I cannot testify to it. At last, laying his hand on Barabbas' arm, he said, "You see, I was not with my master when he suffered and died. By then I had taken to my heels, forsaken him and fled. And before that I had even denied him. That is the very worst of all, that I denied him. How can he forgive me if he returns? What shall I say? What shall I answer when he asks me about it?" And so we recognize this is Peter. Peter is never named in this book, but we recognize that this is Peter. And he's rocking and weeping. And do you think he can forgive me? Barabbas answered that he thought so. He was not particularly interested in what the other man told him, but he said it all the same, partly by way of assent and partly because he could not help liking this man who sat there, accusing himself like any criminal, though he had done nothing. Who hasn't let somebody down in one way or another? The man gripped his hand, and Peter, and held it tightly in his. "Do you think so? Do you think so?" he repeated in a thick voice. And so we see Barabbas is like so freaked out by his experience and continuing just to be so baffled that he doesn't even he just casually is like, "Yeah, Peter, everybody's messed up. We're good." And it's what Peter needs to hear. It really like helps him pick himself back up. And so Barabbas goes and he hides out, if they've been saying that this guy's gonna resurrect himself, okay. So he goes and he's laying out there and he sees something weird again, but he can't put his mind to it. He can't put his language to it. And it has this authentic eyewitness feel throughout the book, where Barabbas really never has the language to describe what he's seeing or how he feels. He just knows something weird is going on. And we get this sense, he understands this idea of there are believing Christians, there are people who believe Jesus Christ was the Messiah, that he has risen from the dead. And Barabbas, even though he was there and saw the resurrection, afterwards is like, well, I think maybe I just saw something. Maybe it was just a trick. I had been tired. When I saw the crucifixion and everything got weird, that was because I had been in a jail cell for a week, chained down, and the light just messed with my eyes. And so he kind of goes through these types of rationalizations, and he does it just in a very focused way. He doesn't belabor it, but it very clearly haunts him. And so there's this idea, he just can't accept the idea that someone would choose to die for Barabbas. Barabbas has never, he doesn't know who either of his parents are. We're told later that his father was a leader of bandits who they assaulted a Moabite woman and then sort of sold her off to a brothel where she was already pregnant with Barabbas. She was then kicked out from there, died in childbirth. He ends up going, unbeknownst to himself, later on hanging out with this gang led by his father, whom he's never known. They fight each other. It's his father who gave him the scar. He later throws his father off the cliff, which, if you think, it somewhat is a parallel of some of the temptations Jesus had, the whole cast yourself down from the top of the temple and the angels will save you. And Barabbas throws his father from a great height and kills him. And so this idea of Christ knows who his father is, he knows who his mother is, he has a relationship with both of them, and Barabbas does not have that. He doesn't know who either are, and so there's this really interesting parallel. Another one is this idea, he interacts with Christians, and they always talk about how the Messiah has died for all of them, has resurrected for all of them, and Barabbas is always sort of, well, but he really died for me. I was the one whose place he took. He really did it for me. There's this different connection, and it's a really interesting way to explore, I think, that early aspect of Christianity. What would it be like to be a person hearing about a Messiah who died like a slave? What would it be like to have actually had, we Christians talk, and I'm a believing Christian, but Christians talk about the idea that Christ has sacrificed himself for us. But Barabbas has this sense of this actually happened. It's very imminent and real to him, and he still can't quite take that final step. there's this idea, he doesn't pray. He guards his friend in copper mines as an old man, as slaves in copper mines. He guards his friend so that his friend can pray, but he won't. He allows his friend to carve, Christos, Jesus with an eye on the back of his slave medallion. So it says, the emperor is here, but really this is who I really, on my slave marker, this is who I really belong to. And then when confronted with it, he just kind of lets the Roman magistrate cross it out. But he's always he's always searching. He's always searching. He's always searching for the Christians or for this brotherhood group. He wants this sense of belonging that he never quite gets, and so he ultimately ends up in Rome. He reconnects with Peter there right in the final 5 pages. They're in a jail cell together after the Great Fire. And so everyone is let out, chained to someone else to be crucified, but there's an odd number, and so Barabbas is not chained with anybody. And so he never quite captures that sense of belonging. And so it has this tragic feel to it, but there is also this hopeful aspect where Barabbas is able to recognize the community that others have, and he really wants to be part of that in so many ways, even though he doesn't get to be. So it was a very tragic book, but I really appreciated it. This is the second time I read it. I read it probably about 10 years ago and thought it was interesting. I was like, oh, why was this a Nobel Prize winner? But reading it again, at 34, it was an interesting way to approach these ideas. So that was Barabbas by Pär Lagerkvist for maybe Midrash, and still working on the varieties of religious experiences with by William James. So thank you, everybody.